In a quiet little town surrounded by green hills and thick woods, there lived a man named John Miller. He was not like the other men in the town. John had spent more than 20 years of his life serving his country as a soldier. His bravery on the battlefield had earned him medals and honors, but when he came back home, things were far from easy. The world outside the army was different from what he remembered, and adjusting to civilian life turned out to be harder than he ever imagined. John's struggles began almost immediately after he returned. Bills piled up while he was away at war, and now they loomed over him like storm clouds. Creditors called constantly, demanding payments he couldn't make. His savings had run dry during his time overseas, leaving him with no cushion to fall back on. Despite his best efforts to find steady work, jobs were scarce and many employers hesitated to hire someone who carried the invisible scars of war. Nightmares plagued his sleep, and memories of battles fought long ago lingered in his mind. Yet through it all, John clung to one thing that gave him strength: his faith. Faith had been John's anchor throughout his years in the military. Whether he was stationed in deserts under scorching suns or hiding in trenches during freezing nights, prayer had always brought him comfort. It reminded him that even in the darkest moments he wasn't alone. So, when the weight of his financial troubles became unbearable, John did what he had always done. He prayed. But this time, his prayer would lead to something neither he nor anyone else could have predicted. One crisp autumn morning, John found himself sitting nervously in a courtroom. The air inside was stale, filled with the faint smell of old wood and paper. Rows of wooden benches lined the walls, occupied by people waiting for their cases to be heard. Some whispered quietly to each other, while others stared blankly ahead, lost in thought. John sat near the front, clutching a worn leather wallet containing a few faded photographs of his family. His heart pounded as he listened to the murmurs around him, wondering how his own case would unfold. The judge entered the room then, a tall figure dressed in black robes that seemed to swallow him whole. His face was stern, his expression unreadable. As he took his seat behind the large wooden bench, the room fell silent. One by one, cases were called and decisions were made. John watched as people stood before the judge, some pleading for leniency, others arguing fiercely against accusations. Each ruling felt final, unyielding and absolute. When John's name was finally called, he rose slowly to his feet, feeling every eye in the room turn toward him. Standing before the judge, John felt small. The room suddenly seemed bigger, colder, and more intimidating. His lawyer spoke first, explaining the circumstances surrounding John's unpaid debts. The creditor's representative followed, presenting their side of the story. Back and forth they went, voices rising and falling like waves crashing against a shore. Through it all, John remained silent, his head bowed slightly as he tried to focus on staying calm. But beneath the surface, his thoughts raced. He thought about his service, the sacrifices he had made, and the promises he had kept. And then, he thought about God. As the arguments continued, John felt an overwhelming urge to pray. It wasn't planned, it just happened. Closing his eyes, he folded his hands together and began to whisper softly. The words came naturally, flowing from his lips like a gentle stream. "Please, Lord," he murmured, "help me find justice. Help them see the truth." His voice was barely audible, drowned out by the louder exchanges happening around him. Still, he prayed with all his heart, seeking guidance and peace in a moment of chaos. Unbeknownst to John, someone noticed. A bailiff standing nearby leaned, closer to the judge, pointing discreetly at John. "Your Honor," the bailiff said in a low tone. "He's praying. Isn't that against protocol?" The judge paused, his pen hovering midair above a sheet of paper. For a brief moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then, without hesitation, the gavel struck the desk with a sharp crack. Everyone froze, turning, their attention to the source of the sound. "Mr. Miller," the judge said sternly, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "This is a court of law, not a place of worship. Your actions are disrespectful and will not be tolerated." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to feel sympathy for John or agree with the judge's decision. John himself stood frozen, stunned by the rebuke. Slowly, he opened his eyes and looked up at the judge, confusion and hurt etched across his face. I didn't mean any disrespect, Your Honor, John stammered, his voice trembling. I was only asking for guidance. Praying helps me stay strong. The judge's expression didn't soften. Instead, he reiterated his stance, making it clear that such behavior would not be permitted in his courtroom. With another firm strike of the gavel, the matter was dismissed, and the proceedings moved on to the next case. But for John, the damage was done. He left the courthouse that day feeling defeated, humiliated, and deeply unsettled. News of the incident spread quickly. By evening, word had reached nearly every corner of the town. Conversations buzzed in cafes, grocery stores, and parks. People debated passionately, some siding with the judge and others defending John's right to pray. Social media platforms lit up with posts condemning the ruling, while local news outlets scrambled to cover the story. Before long, it became clear that this was no ordinary legal dispute. It was a clash of values, a test of where boundaries should be drawn between personal beliefs and public institutions. For John, the days following the trial were difficult. Friends and neighbors approached him with words of encouragement, but their kindness only highlighted the loneliness he felt. Strangers stopped him on the street, wanting to shake his hand or thank him for his service. Reporters knocked on his door, eager to hear his side of the story. Though touched by the outpouring of support, John couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow failed. Not just himself, but everyone who believed in the principles of freedom and fairness. Meanwhile, the judge faced mounting criticism. Letters poured into the courthouse, some praising his commitment to maintaining order, others accusing him of insensitivity. Fellow judges weighed in, discussing the delicate balance between enforcing rules and showing compassion. Even members of the community who initially supported the ruling began to question whether justice had truly been served. The once clear lines between right and wrong blurred, leaving everyone involved to grapple with uncomfortable truths. As weeks passed, the story grew beyond the confines of the small town. National newspapers picked it up, framing it as a pivotal moment in the ongoing debate about religious freedom in America. Talk shows invited experts to discuss the implications of the judge's decision. Veterans organizations rallied behind John, using his experience as a rallying cry for reform. What started as a simple act of prayer had ignited a firestorm, forcing people to confront questions they might otherwise have ignored. Through it all, John remained grounded. He refused to let bitterness take root in his heart, choosing instead to focus on the lessons he had learned during his time in the military. Resilience, patience, and understanding. These were the qualities that had carried him through countless battles, and they would carry him through this one too. Little did he know, however, that the journey was far from over. The echoes of that fateful courtroom session would continue to reverberate, shaping lives and sparking changes in ways no one could have anticipated. The days following the courtroom incident were long and heavy for John Miller. He woke up each morning, feeling as though a storm cloud followed him wherever he went. The weight of the judge's words lingered in his mind, replaying over and over, like a broken record. "This is a court of law, not a place of worship," the judge had said, his tone sharp and unyielding. Those words stung more than John cared to admit. They weren't just about what happened in that courtroom. They felt like a judgment on who he was as a person, on the beliefs that had kept him going through some of the hardest moments of his life. John tried to keep busy. He spent hours working, odd jobs around town, anything to distract himself from the swirling thoughts in his head. Sometimes he helped fix fences for neighbors. Other times, he loaded boxes at the local warehouse. Physical labor gave him a sense of purpose, even if it was fleeting. But no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't escape the whispers that seemed to follow him everywhere. People talked. In grocery stores, at bus stops, even in church. Some offered kind smiles and pats on the back, while others avoided eye contact altogether. It was as if the entire town had taken sides, and John didn't know where he fit anymore. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, John sat alone on the porch of his small rented house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He stared out at the horizon, clutching a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His mind wandered back to his days in the military, the camaraderie, the shared struggles, the moments when faith had been the only thing keeping him and his fellow soldiers going. Back then, prayer wasn't just something you did quietly in your bunk. It was a lifeline, a way to connect with something greater than yourself. Now, it felt like a burden, a source of shame. As the weeks passed, the story of John's courtroom ordeal spread far beyond the borders of the small town. A journalist named Sarah Collins, known for her investigative pieces on social issues, stumbled upon the case while researching veterans' rights. Intrigued by the details, she decided to dig deeper. Sarah traveled to the town, determined to uncover the truth behind the headlines. She began by interviewing locals, shopkeepers, teachers, veterans, and even the bailiff who had reported John's prayer to the judge. Each conversation added another layer to the story, revealing complexities Sarah hadn't anticipated. Sarah eventually reached out to John, asking if he'd be willing to speak with her. At first, John hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to relive the humiliation of that day or put himself in the spotlight again. But something about Sarah's sincerity struck a chord. She wasn't looking for drama or sensationalism. She genuinely wanted to understand. After some thought, John agreed to meet her at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Their conversation lasted for hours. John opened up about his time in the military, the challenges of returning home, and the emotional toll of the courtroom incident. He spoke candidly about his faith, explaining how prayer had always been a source of strength for him, not just in war zones but in everyday life. Sarah listened intently, taking notes and occasionally nodding in understanding. By the end of their talk, she felt certain that John's story needed to be told, not just locally but nationally. When Sarah's article was published, it sent shockwaves across the country. Titled "A Veteran's Prayer Faith on Trial," the piece captured the hearts of readers nationwide. It painted a vivid picture of John's journey, highlighting both his resilience and the systemic failures that left veterans like him struggling to reintegrate into civilian life. The article sparked outrage, compassion, and debate. Letters poured into newspapers, radio shows buzzed with callers sharing their opinions, and social media lit up with hashtags supporting John and criticizing the judge's decision. Back in the small town, the reaction was mixed. Some residents rallied around John, organizing protests outside the courthouse to demand justice. Signs reading, "Freedom of Religion Matters" and "Stand with Our Veterans" dotted the streets. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether John's actions truly warranted such an uproar. Even within the legal community, opinions were divided. Lawyers debated the fine line between respecting individual rights and maintaining courtroom decorum. Judges privately wondered how they would have handled a similar situation. For the judge, the growing controversy became unbearable. Once respected and admired for his strict adherence to the rules, he now found himself at the center of a firestorm. Anonymous letters flooded his office, many filled with anger and accusations. Some called him heartless, while others accused him of trampling on constitutional rights. The pressure mounted with each passing day, making it difficult for him to focus on his work. Sleep eluded him, and when he did manage to close his eyes, visions of John's face haunted his dreams. Determined to find a way forward, the judge began seeking advice from colleagues and mentors. He attended seminars on empathy in leadership and read books about balancing justice with compassion. Slowly, he started to see the situation from a different perspective. What if John's prayer hadn't been an act of defiance, but rather a cry for help? What if enforcing rigid protocols had overshadowed the humanity of the moment? These questions weighed heavily on the judge's conscience, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his role in the courtroom. One afternoon, the judge made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He requested a private meeting with John. Through Sarah, who had stayed in touch with John, the invitation was extended. John was hesitant at first. Why would the judge want to meet with him now after everything that had happened? Was this some kind of trick? But curiosity, and perhaps a glimmer of hope, prompted him to accept. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a quiet park on the outskirts of town. The air was crisp, and leaves crunched underfoot as the two men approached each other cautiously. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the judge broke the silence. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice softer than John had ever heard it, "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air, raw and unexpected. John blinked, unsure how to respond. The judge continued, explaining how he had been caught between duty and morality, how the fear of appearing weak or biased had clouded his judgment. He admitted that condemning John for praying had been a mistake, a failure to recognize the depth of his faith and the struggles he faced. As he spoke, his voice cracked with emotion and tears welled up in his eyes. John listened carefully, absorbing every word. When the judge finished, there was a long pause. Finally, John nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means a lot." He went on to share stories from his time in the military, describing the bonds forged through hardship and the power of faith in the darkest moments. The judge listened intently, realizing for the first time the true weight of what John had endured. By the end of their conversation, something remarkable had happened. Two men, once adversaries, had found common ground. Forgiveness replaced resentment, and understanding bridged the gap between them. Word of their reconciliation spread quickly, adding a new chapter to the unfolding story. People marveled at the transformation, seeing it as proof that even the deepest wounds could heal with time and effort. In the weeks that followed, the impact of John's experience rippled outward. Lawmakers began drafting legislation to address the intersection of faith and public institutions, ensuring that individuals like John wouldn't face similar condemnation in the future. Judges across the country participated in training programs designed to foster empathy and adaptability in the courtroom. And John? He emerged as a symbol of resilience and grace, using his platform to advocate for veterans' rights and mental health awareness. Though the scars of that fateful courtroom session remained, they no longer defined John or the judge. Instead, they served as reminders of the power of forgiveness, the importance of listening, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. As John often reflected in the years to come, sometimes the smallest acts of courage could spark the biggest changes. And in this case, a simple prayer had ignited a movement that touched countless lives. The days after the private meeting between John Miller and the judge marked a turning point, not just for them, but for the entire town. News of their reconciliation spread quickly, thanks in part to Sarah Collins, the journalist who had covered John's story from the beginning. She wrote a follow-up article detailing the apology and the heartfelt conversation that had taken place in the park. Readers were moved by the judge's vulnerability and John's willingness to forgive. It was a rare moment of unity in a world often divided by opinions and ideologies. As the story gained even more attention, people began to see it as more than just a legal dispute or a debate about religious freedom. It became a lesson in humanity, a reminder that behind every headline, there are real people with real emotions. The judge, once criticized for his rigidness, was now praised for his humility. John, who had been condemned for praying, emerged as a symbol of resilience and grace. Together, they showed that mistakes could be acknowledged, bridges could be rebuilt, and healing was possible. For John, life started to feel a little lighter. The weight of humiliation that had pressed down on him since the courtroom incident began to lift. Strangers approached him with smiles instead of sideways glances. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance invited him over for coffee or dinner. Even the local church pastor reached out, asking if John would speak at an upcoming service about faith and perseverance. At first, John hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he enjoyed, especially when it involved sharing such personal struggles. But after some encouragement from Sarah and a few close friends, he agreed. On the day of the sermon, the small church was packed. People filled the pews, eager to hear what John had to say. Some came out of curiosity, others out of admiration, and a few simply because they wanted to support him. As John stood at the podium, clutching a Bible in one hand and a piece of paper with notes in the other, he felt nervous but determined. He took a deep breath, looked out at the sea of faces, and began to speak. "I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers," he started, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside him. "I don't. What I can tell you is this. Faith has carried me through some of the hardest times of my life. When I was overseas, fighting battles most of us can't imagine, prayer gave me hope. When I came home and struggled to find my footing, prayer reminded me that I wasn't alone. And yes, even when I stood in that courtroom and got reprimanded for believing in something bigger than myself, prayer kept me grounded." His words resonated deeply with the congregation. Many nodded, along while others wiped away tears. John went on to share stories from his time in the military, stories of brotherhood, sacrifice, and moments when faith had been the only thing keeping him and his fellow soldiers going. He spoke about the challenges of returning home, the isolation he had felt, and how the courtroom incident had shaken his confidence. But he also talked about forgiveness, both giving it and receiving it. By the end of his speech, the room erupted in applause, and several people lined up to thank him personally. Meanwhile, the judge found himself reflecting on the changes happening within him. Apologizing to John hadn't been easy. It required swallowing his pride and admitting fault, but it had been necessary. For years, he had prided himself on being fair and impartial, never letting emotions interfere with his rulings. Yet as he thought back on his career, he realized that fairness didn't always mean sticking rigidly to rules. Sometimes it meant listening with an open heart and recognizing the humanity in every person who stepped into his courtroom. Determined to grow from the experience, the judge began implementing subtle changes in how he conducted proceedings. He encouraged attorneys to present their cases with clarity and compassion, reminding them that each client had a story worth hearing. He allowed brief moments of silence before major decisions, giving everyone in the room, including himself, a chance to reflect. These adjustments might have seemed small, but they made a big difference. Lawyers noticed the shift, and defendants left the courtroom feeling seen rather than dismissed. Word of the judge's transformation reached higher levels of the judicial system. Other judges took note, discussing the importance of empathy alongside authority. Training programs for new judges began incorporating lessons on emotional intelligence and cultural sensitivity. Even seasoned professionals attended workshops designed to help them navigate complex situations with greater understanding. Slowly but surely, the ripple effects of John's prayer and the judge's apology spread far beyond the confines of the small town. Back in the community, the atmosphere continued to improve. Protests outside the courthouse turned into peaceful gatherings focused on education and advocacy. Local leaders organized forums where residents could voice concerns about systemic issues affecting veterans and marginalized groups. Schools incorporated discussions about tolerance and inclusivity into their curriculums, using John's story as a teaching tool. Businesses set up funds to support veterans struggling with financial hardships, inspired by the outpouring of solidarity following the controversy. John threw himself into these efforts, becoming a vocal advocate for change. He partnered with organizations dedicated to helping veterans reintegrate into civilian life, speaking at events and raising awareness about the unique challenges they faced. His message was simple, yet powerful. No one should have to fight their battles alone. Whether it was securing affordable housing, accessing mental health resources, or finding meaningful employment, John believed that communities had a responsibility to stand by those who had served. Sarah Collins stayed closely connected to John throughout this journey, documenting his evolution from a man wrongfully condemned to a beacon of hope. Her articles captured not only his successes, but also the ongoing struggles many veterans faced. Through her writing, she challenged readers to look beyond stereotypes and recognize the courage it took to rebuild lives shattered by war. Her work, earned her awards and recognition, but more importantly, it inspired action. One evening, as John sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on how much had changed since that fateful day in court. The road hadn't been easy. There were still moments of doubt and frustration, but he had come so far. He thought about the judge, whose apology had opened doors to healing and growth. He thought about the countless strangers who had reached out with messages of support, proving that kindness existed even in the darkest times. And he thought about his faith, which had guided him through it all. Just then, a car pulled up in front of his house. It was Sarah, holding a folder filled with papers. "Hey, John," she said with a smile as she climbed the steps to join him on the porch. "I've got something you need to see." Curious, John leaned forward as she handed him the folder. Inside were letters from veterans across the country, thanking him for sharing his story and inspiring them to seek help. There were also invitations to speak at national conferences and collaborate on policy changes aimed at improving conditions for returning soldiers. John flipped through the pages, overwhelmed by the response. "I never expected any of this," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's the thing about standing up for what you believe in, John. You never know who's watching, or how far your actions will reach." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the quiet town, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. His journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. After all, he had already proven that even in the face of adversity, faith, forgiveness, and determination could pave the way for change. And that was a lesson worth sharing with the world. As weeks turned into months, John Miller's life began to transform in ways he could never have imagined. The attention his story received wasn't just fleeting curiosity, it sparked real change. People from all walks of life reached out to him, sharing their own struggles and asking for advice. Veterans battling PTSD wrote heartfelt letters, thanking John for giving them the courage to seek help. Parents of soldiers serving overseas sent notes of gratitude, saying his resilience inspired them to hold on to hope. Even teachers used his story in classrooms to teach students about perseverance, forgiveness, and the importance of standing up for one's beliefs. John embraced this newfound role with humility. He didn't see himself as a hero or a leader. He was simply someone who had faced challenges and kept moving forward. But he understood the power of storytelling and how it could connect people. So, he started speaking more openly about his experiences, not just in churches or community centers, but also at schools, conferences, and even legislative hearings. His message was always the same: we're stronger together. No matter what you've been through, there's a way forward. One day, an invitation arrived that surprised even John. It was from a national organization dedicated to supporting veterans' mental health. They wanted him to speak at their annual gala in Washington, D.C., an event attended by lawmakers, activists, and influential figures from across the country. At first, John hesitated. The thought of addressing such a large and prestigious audience made him uneasy. But Sarah Collins encouraged him, reminding him of the impact his words could have. "This is your chance to make a difference on a bigger stage," she said. "Think about all the lives you could touch." With some reluctance, John accepted the invitation. In preparation, he worked closely with Sarah and a few close friends to craft a speech that would resonate with the diverse crowd. He wanted to be honest without being overly dramatic, relatable without losing authenticity. As the date of the gala approached, nervousness gnawed at him, but excitement grew too. This was an opportunity not just to share his story, but to advocate for systemic changes that could improve the lives of countless veterans. The night of the gala arrived and John stood backstage, adjusting his tie for the 100th time. The ballroom buzzed with energy. Elegant chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with white linens and floral arrangements. Guests mingled, laughing and chatting, while waitstaff circulated with trays of champagne. John peeked through the curtain, feeling both awe and intimidation. He had never been in a room like this before, surrounded by people whose decisions shaped policies and laws. When his name was called, John walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. Spotlights illuminated him as he stepped up to the microphone. For a moment he froze, overwhelmed by the sea of faces staring back at him. Then he remembered why he was there, to give voice to those who felt voiceless. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "I'm not here because I'm special," he started, his voice steady despite the nerves coursing through him. "I'm here because I represent so many others who are struggling in silence. Men and women who served our country, who gave everything they had, only to come home and feel forgotten. I know what it's like to carry burdens no one else can see. I know what it's like to feel like the system has failed you." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. "But I also know what it means, to find strength in faith, in community, and in forgiveness. If my story teaches you anything, let it be this. We need to do better. We need to listen more, judge less, and act with compassion. Our veterans deserve nothing less." By the time John finished speaking, the audience was on its feet, applauding loudly. Some wiped away tears while others nodded in agreement. Afterward, people lined up to shake his hand, expressing admiration and gratitude. Lawmakers promised to push for reforms, including increased funding for mental health programs and improved access to resources for returning soldiers. Journalists asked for interviews, eager to capture the essence of the man behind the movement. By the end of the evening, John realized something profound. His voice mattered, and when used wisely, it could create waves of positive change. Back home, the effects of John's growing influence became evident. Local businesses pledged to hire more veterans, offering training programs tailored to their needs. Schools implemented initiatives to support children of military families, ensuring they felt included and valued. Even the courthouse where John had once been reprimanded underwent changes. A plaque was installed near the entrance, commemorating the incident and celebrating the lessons learned from it. The inscription read, "In memory of a moment that reminded us justice must be tempered with humanity." Meanwhile, the judge continued his journey of self-reflection and growth. He became an advocate for reform within the judicial system, pushing for policies that prioritized empathy alongside legality. During meetings with fellow judges, he shared insights gained from his experience with John, urging them to consider the human element in every case. "Rules are important," he often said, "but they shouldn't overshadow the reason we're here, to serve justice fairly and compassionately." His efforts earned him respect among colleagues, many of whom admitted they had underestimated the value of emotional intelligence in their work. Together, they developed guidelines allowing moments of reflection or prayer in courtrooms under specific circumstances. These changes might have seemed minor, but they represented a significant shift in mindset, a recognition that the law should adapt to meet the needs of those it served. As the months passed, John and the judge crossed paths occasionally, usually at community events focused on veterans' rights or judicial reform. Their interactions were always cordial, marked by mutual respect and understanding. Though their relationship would never be close in the traditional sense, it carried a unique depth born from shared vulnerability and reconciliation. Each encounter served as a reminder of how far they had come since that tense day in court. Sarah Collins remained a constant presence in John's life, chronicling his journey and amplifying his message through her writing. Her articles highlighted not only John's achievements but also the broader societal shifts inspired by his story. She interviewed experts, policymakers, and everyday citizens, weaving their perspectives into narratives that challenged readers to think critically about issues like religious freedom, veterans' rights, and systemic inequality. Her work earned widespread acclaim, solidifying her reputation as a journalist committed to truth and justice. One afternoon, as John sat in his favorite cafe sipping coffee, Sarah joined him with a stack of papers in hand. "I've got something exciting to show you," she said, sliding a document across the table. It was a draft of a bill currently being debated in Congress, a piece of legislation aimed at improving support systems for veterans. One section explicitly referenced John's courtroom incident, citing it as an example of why flexibility and inclusivity were essential in public institutions. John skimmed the document, his eyes widening with disbelief. "Is this real?" he asked, looking up at Sarah. She grinned. "Very real. Your story is making history, John. People are listening, and they're taking action." That evening, John sat alone on his porch, reflecting on the incredible chain of events set in motion by a simple act of prayer. What had started as a personal moment of faith had grown into a nationwide conversation about dignity, fairness, and the power of forgiveness. He thought about the judge, whose apology had opened doors to healing and growth. He thought about the countless strangers who had rallied around him, proving that kindness existed even in the darkest times. And he thought about his faith, which had guided him through it all. Just then, a soft breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining his street, carrying with it a sense of peace. John smiled, realizing that his journey wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection, about showing others that no matter how broken things seemed, there was always a path toward healing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, John felt a deep sense of gratitude. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. And that, he decided, was enough. The months rolled on, and John Miller's life took on a rhythm he hadn't known before, a mix of purpose, busyness, and quiet reflection. He had become more than just a man who prayed in court. He was now a symbol of resilience, faith, and the power of forgiveness. His days were filled with speaking engagements, meetings with community leaders, and conversations with veterans seeking guidance. At night, he often sat on his porch, sipping tea and thinking about how far he'd come since that fateful day in the courtroom. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Sarah Collins arrived at John's house with an envelope in her hand. She looked excited, almost giddy, as she handed it to him. "Open it," she urged, sitting down beside him on the porch steps. Curious, John tore open the envelope and pulled out a letter. It was from a national veterans organization inviting him to join their board of directors. They wanted him to help shape policies and advocate for reforms that would directly impact the lives of returning soldiers. John stared at the letter, stunned. "They want me?" he asked, looking at Sarah. She nodded enthusiastically. "Of course they do. You've already made such a difference, John. Imagine what you could do with even more resources and influence." The idea was daunting, but also thrilling. For so long, John had felt powerless against the system, but now he had a chance to be part of changing it from within. After some thought and plenty of encouragement from Sarah, John accepted the offer. Over the next few weeks, he attended orientation sessions and met with other board members. Many of them were seasoned professionals with years of experience in advocacy work. At first, John felt out of place among them, unsure if his voice carried the same weight. But as discussions unfolded, he realized that his perspective was invaluable. He spoke not from theory or policy manuals, but from lived experience, offering insights no textbook could provide. His contributions quickly earned him respect within the organization. Together with the team, John worked on initiatives ranging from improving access to mental health care for veterans to creating mentorship programs that paired younger soldiers with older ones who understood their struggles. They also collaborated with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at addressing gaps in support systems. Each victory, no matter how small, felt monumental because it meant progress for people like him, people who had given so much and deserved better upon returning home. While John dove into his new role, the judge continued his own journey of transformation. Inspired by the changes sparked by John's story, he became a vocal advocate for reform within the judicial system. He traveled to conferences and seminars, sharing his experiences and urging colleagues to embrace empathy alongside authority. "Justice isn't just about following rules," he often said during these talks. "It's about understanding the people standing before us, their fears, their hopes, their humanity." His message resonated deeply with many judges, particularly those who had grappled with similar dilemmas in their own courtrooms. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. Judges started incorporating moments of reflection into proceedings, allowing defendants and attorneys alike to pause and gather their thoughts. Courtrooms, once rigid and impersonal, began to feel more like spaces where justice truly served everyone equally. Back in the town where it all began, the ripple effects of John's story continued to spread. Local schools introduced programs teaching students about civic responsibility, using John's ordeal as a case study in balancing rights with respect. Businesses pledged to hire more veterans, offering training and mentorship tailored to their unique needs. Even the courthouse underwent renovations, not just physical ones but cultural shifts too. A plaque commemorating the incident remained prominently displayed near the entrance, serving as a reminder of the lessons learned. As winter approached, John found himself reflecting on the past year. So much had changed, not just in his life, but in the lives of others touched by his story. One chilly morning he received another unexpected invitation. This time, it was from a university hosting a conference on social justice and systemic reform. They wanted him to deliver the keynote address, sharing his insights on how personal acts of courage could lead to widespread change. Though flattered, John felt a familiar pang of nervousness. Public speaking still didn't come naturally to him, especially when addressing large crowds. But he reminded himself why he did it: to give voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. With Sarah's help, he prepared tirelessly, crafting a speech that balanced honesty with hope. On the day of the conference, John stood backstage, adjusting his tie and taking deep breaths to calm his nerves. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation, packed with students, professors, activists, and policymakers eager to hear what he had to say. When his name was called, he walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. Spotlights illuminated him as he stepped up to the podium, gripping the edges tightly. "I'm here today because of a moment that changed my life forever," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies fluttering in his stomach. "A moment when I prayed quietly in a courtroom and was condemned for it. That moment taught me something important. Sometimes standing firm in your beliefs can shake things loose enough to make room for change." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. But change doesn't happen alone. It takes courage, yes, but it also takes listening. It takes forgiveness. And most importantly, it takes recognizing that we're all human. We all have struggles, fears, and dreams worth fighting for. By the time John finished speaking, the audience erupted into applause. People lined up afterward to thank him, some shaking his hand while others hugged him tightly. Lawmakers promised to push for further reforms. Educators vowed to incorporate his story into their curriculums, and activists pledged to keep the momentum going. By the end of the event, John realized something profound. His journey wasn't just about him anymore. It belonged to everyone it had touched. In the weeks that followed, John returned to his routine, though it felt richer somehow. He spent more time connecting with veterans, hearing their stories, and helping them navigate challenges. He also kept in touch with the judge, exchanging occasional emails or meeting for coffee. Their relationship remained respectful and supportive, a testament to the healing power of forgiveness. Sarah Collins stayed close to John too, documenting his ongoing efforts and amplifying his message through her writing. Her articles highlighted not only his achievements but also the broader societal shifts inspired by his story. She interviewed experts, policymakers, and everyday citizens, weaving their perspectives into narratives that challenged readers to think critically about issues like religious freedom, veterans' rights, and systemic inequality. Her work earned widespread acclaim, solidifying her reputation as a journalist committed to truth and justice. One crisp afternoon, as John sat on his porch watching the leaves fall from the trees, he thought about how far he'd come. From a soldier struggling to adjust to civilian life to a man whose simple act of prayer had ignited a movement, his journey had been anything but ordinary. Yet, he knew the work wasn't done. There were still battles to fight, injustices to confront, and hearts to heal. Just then, a soft knock sounded at the door. It was Sarah, holding a thick folder filled with papers. "I've got something exciting to show you," she said, sitting down beside him. Inside the folder were letters from veterans across the country, thanking him for inspiring them to seek help. There were also invitations to collaborate on projects aimed at improving conditions for returning soldiers. John flipped through the pages, overwhelmed by the response. "I never expected any of this," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's the thing about standing up for what you believe in, John. You never know who's watching, or how far your actions will reach." As the sun set over the hills, casting a golden glow over the quiet town, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. His journey wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. After all, he had already proven that even in the face of adversity, faith, forgiveness, and determination could pave the way for change. And that was a lesson worth sharing with the world. As the years passed, John Miller's story became more than just a memory. It grew into a legacy. The man who had once been condemned for praying in court was now celebrated as a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and change. His journey had touched countless lives, sparking conversations that reached far beyond the small town where it all began. Yet despite the recognition and admiration he received, John remained humble. He often said, "I didn't do anything special. I just tried to stay true to myself." John continued his work with the Veterans Organization, traveling across the country to speak at events, meet with policymakers, and advocate for reforms. Each trip brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to make a difference. He visited military bases, community centers, and schools, sharing his experiences and encouraging others to find strength in their struggles. Veterans approached him after these talks, thanking him for giving them hope. Some told him they had finally sought counseling after hearing his story. Others said they felt inspired to pursue careers helping fellow soldiers adjust to civilian further. One day, while attending a conference in Washington, D.C., John received an invitation that took his breath away. It was from the White House, a request for him to join a task force focused on improving mental health resources for veterans. The letter praised his advocacy work and emphasized the importance of having voices like his at the table when shaping policies. For a moment, John sat frozen, holding the paper in trembling hands. Then, tears welled up in his eyes, not of sadness but of gratitude. This was a chance to create lasting change, not just for himself, but for generations to come. With Sarah's encouragement, John accepted the invitation. Over the next several months, he worked alongside experts, lawmakers, and fellow veterans to develop programs addressing everything from PTSD treatment to job placement services. They held meetings late into the night, debating strategies and refining proposals until every detail was perfect. Though exhausting, the process filled John with purpose. He knew that each decision they made could save lives. Meanwhile, the judge's efforts to reform the judicial system gained momentum. Inspired by John's example, he collaborated with colleagues to draft guidelines ensuring courtroom procedures respected individual beliefs without compromising fairness. Judges nationwide adopted these practices, transforming courtrooms into spaces where compassion and justice coexisted. Law. Schools incorporated case studies based on John's ordeal into their curriculums, teaching future lawyers and judges the value of empathy and leadership. Back in the small town, reminders of John's impact were everywhere. A local park was renamed in his honor, featuring benches engraved with messages of hope and unity. Schools hosted annual essay contests asking students to reflect on themes of faith, forgiveness, and perseverance. Businesses pledged ongoing support for veteran-focused initiatives, creating scholarships and hiring incentives. Even the courthouse, once the site of conflict, stood as a testament to growth and understanding. Its plaque served as a daily reminder that progress required courage and humility. Despite his growing influence, John never lost sight of what mattered most: connection. He stayed in touch with the people whose lives he had touched, the veterans he mentored, the families he supported, and even the judge who had once reprimanded him. Their relationship, though unconventional, deepened over time. They occasionally met for coffee, discussing everything from legal reforms to personal reflections. These conversations reminded John that reconciliation wasn't just about saying sorry, it was about building bridges that lasted. Sarah Collins remained a steadfast ally throughout it all. Her articles chronicled John's evolution, from a man wrongfully condemned to a leader driving meaningful change. She interviewed activists, educators, and everyday citizens influenced by his story, weaving their voices into narratives that challenged readers to think critically about societal issues. Her work earned her awards, but she always credited John for inspiring her. "He showed me what happens when one person stands firm in their beliefs," she often said. "Change starts with courage." One crisp autumn morning, John woke early, unable to shake a feeling of anticipation. Today was the day he would receive an honorary degree from a prestigious university, a gesture recognizing his contributions to social justice and veterans' rights. As he dressed in his suit, memories flooded back. The courtroom incident, the protests, the reconciliation with the judge, and the countless moments since that had shaped him into the man he was today. When John arrived at the university, the campus buzzed with excitement. Students lined the walkways, cheering as he made his way to the stage. Faculty members greeted him warmly, expressing admiration for his unwavering commitment to making the world a better place. When his name was called, he stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause. As he accepted the diploma, he scanned the crowd, his heart swelling with gratitude. This moment wasn't just for him, it belonged to everyone who had supported him along the way. In his acceptance speech, John spoke candidly about his journey. "This isn't my victory," he said, his voice steady yet emotional. "It's ours. Every person who stood by me, every voice that joined mine, every act of kindness, these are the things that made this possible. Never underestimate the power of believing in something bigger than yourself." Afterward, as he mingled with attendees, John reflected on how far he'd come. From a soldier struggling to reintegrate into civilian life to a man whose simple act of prayer had ignited a movement, his path had been anything but ordinary. Yet he knew the work wasn't done. There were still gaps to fill, injustices to confront, and hearts to heal. That evening, as John sat alone on his porch watching the stars twinkle above, he thought about the lessons he'd learned. Faith had carried him through the darkest moments, forgiveness had opened doors to healing, and determination had paved the way for change. But perhaps the greatest lesson of all was that no one walked their journey alone. Whether it was a journalist, documenting his story, a judge admitting fault, or strangers rallying behind him, John had discovered the profound strength of community. Just then, a soft knock sounded at the door. It was Sarah, holding a folder filled with letters and photographs. "Thought you might want to see these," she said, sitting down beside him. Inside were notes from veterans thanking him for saving their lives, pictures of families reunited because of programs he helped create, and invitations to collaborate on projects aimed at fostering inclusivity and understanding. John flipped through the pages, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and gratitude. Tears streamed down his face as he realized the true scope of his impact. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've changed the world, John. Not because you're perfect, but because you kept going even when it hurt." As the night stretched on, John leaned back in his chair, gazing at the sky. He thought about the courtroom incident that had started it all, the judge's apology that had sparked reconciliation, and the countless lives touched by his story. He thought about the battles fought and won, not just in war zones but in boardrooms, classrooms, and communities. And he thought about the future, knowing there was still so much work to be done. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready. After all, he had already proven that even in the face of adversity, faith, forgiveness, and determination could pave the way for change. And that was a lesson worth carrying forward, for himself, for others, and for the world.